Okay, so we're going to talk about the Antebellum period, which is kind of the period from 1789 to 1860, kind of after the American Revolution, maybe a little more after the War of 1812, even though I know it says 1789, up until the Civil War. So that's the Antebellum period in our American history, and it specifically refers to the South. All right, it specifically refers to kind of the lifestyle in the South. So during this time, the nation was pulled apart. All right, sections were being divided, so there was no more nationalism. There was no more pride in our nation because everybody had their own interest. So this idea of sectionalism started to rise, which is loyalty to the interest of a region or section of a country. All right, so sectionalism. All right, the South relied on slavery for plantation farming. The Northeast relied on manufacturing and trade, and the West was just looking for cheap land. So these interests, all right, these interests of each section eventually caused a lot of tension and conflict throughout our nation, and it really came into play as a major issue when Missouri was trying to become a state. So those interests in those sectional areas of our country really kind of fueled the fire for what kind of led up to the Civil War. All right, so the Missouri Compromise. So Missouri wanted to become a state. And before Missouri was a state, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. That's an equal number. That's what they needed. That's what the South needed to make sure that if the North got majority in Congress, they wouldn't eliminate slavery altogether. So the South was worried that if free states got the majority in Congress and the control of the government, they would get rid of slavery altogether. And the South was dependent on slaves for their economy. So Maine also wanted to become a state at this time, the same time Missouri did. So Henry Clay, who's kind of known as the Great Compromiser, proposed the Missouri Compromise. All right, first thing, admit Maine as a free state. Perfect, done. Admit Missouri as a slave state. So now we're still equal here. All right, 11 and 11, now we're 12 and 12. And then slavery was also banned north of the 3630 parallel, which is Missouri's southern border. All right, so this imaginary line that stretches all the way across the United States, is basically says anything south of it, slave, anything north of it, free. All right, that's how it was going to play out. So this kept the power equally split, all right, but it made the South mad because Congress was passing laws about slavery, and the North was mad because we added another slave state in Missouri. All right, so it didn't make everybody happy, but it did answer a lot of the questions regarding Missouri and its admission as a free or slave state. So then you have the abolitionist movement, and abolitionists were against slavery, and they wanted to abolish it. These were people that hated the idea of slavery. They were morally opposed to it, and they wanted it gone. And by 1804, there had been enough abolitionist movements in the North that the North had decided that they should just get rid of slavery altogether. They pledged to end it. So William Lloyd Garrison was a famous abolitionist. And another guy was Frederick Douglass. He was an escaped slave, and he was also a very famous abolitionist. He wrote a lot of good speeches and articles and stuff. The Underground Railroad was used by abolitionists to help slaves escape from the South to the North. You've got people like Harriet Tubman. You know, at one point there was a huge reward, like $40,000 reward. And back then, it's a lot of money now. Back then, there's a ton of money because the Southerners needed to capture so much because she was doing so much damage to them in the South with slaves attempting to escape. So the Compromise of 1850, this was another attempt by Henry Clay with the help of Stephen Douglas to settle the dispute of adding free states and slave states. So we're still trying to figure out, should a state come into the Union as a slave state or should it come in as a free state? And how do we figure that out? All right, so for the North, California was admitted as a free state and slavery was banned in the nation's capital. That was part of it. So for the North, California came as a free state and no slavery in the nation's capital under the Compromise of 1850. For the South, popular sovereignty, which means people had the right to vote, would be used to decide the issue of slavery. So let people vote whether or not they wanted to have slaves or not. And they got a new fugitive slave law, which we'll talk about on the next board, and this was very controversial down here. So that's the Compromise of 1850, which kind of leads into the Fugitive Slave Law or Fugitive Slave Act. This allows special government officials to basically go up and arrest runaway slaves. All right, and if suspects were caught, they had no right to trial, and their trial was seen by a federal commissioner and not a judge. So they didn't have any fairness when they were captured. And what was crazy about it, what caused a lot of outrage, was that all it took was for one white man or one white American to swear any African American was at once a slave, and they could be arrested. That slave could be arrested as a runaway, even if they weren't. If one white American swore, that's all it took. All right, so obviously you had a lot of people lying for the sake of getting slaves back. So Northerners also were required by law to help capture slaves. And if they chose not to help these Southerners capture slaves, they could be arrested. All right, so that caused a lot of outrage. This was the most controversial part of the Compromise of 1850. All right, it drew a ton more supporters to the abolitionist movement. A lot of people rallied behind that the unfairness of this law, and they just saw, you know, we are morally opposed to slavery. Let's get rid of it. So this did more to hurt the South's cause for slavery than it helped as they initially thought. So now the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Senator Stephen Douglas, we talked about it earlier with the other compromises, wanted to organize Nebraska territory into 2 territories. He wanted to give Kansas and Nebraska, he wanted to make them 2 territories, but you got to decide, are they going to be free or are they going to be slave? All right, so Southerners were mad because both territories were close to slavery because they were above that imaginary line settled in the Missouri Compromise. So initially they were always going to be free states. All right, and that angered the South. You can't add these 2 territories unless you're going to give us something. All right, so Douglas suggested slavery in those territories should be decided by popular sovereignty, meaning people can vote on it. So we make the Kansas territory and the Nebraska territory. We let the people that live there decide whether or not they want slavery. All right, it passed, and the act undid the Missouri Compromise because now that line no longer mattered. All right, we just said anything above this line had to be a free state, but now the Kansas-Nebraska had say, oh no, if you know what, forget it, let the people vote. All right, so lots of violence followed this because settlers who initially lived there were going to vote one way, and tons of people moved into this territory who didn't initially live there to vote to make sure they could have the majority in the government to vote for either free or slave state. So you basically had 2 groups of people vying for control of a government in these 2 territories, and all this violence and outrage, these 2 groups attacked each other and beat each other, was called Bleeding Kansas. And in this anger over the violence and the pro-slavery events, the anti-slavery forces, so the abolitionists, the anti-slavery people, created the Republican Party. So the Dred Scott decision, all right, this is a huge monumental court case. All right, the Dred Scott decision, otherwise known as Dred Scott v. Sanford, excuse me. Dred Scott was an enslaved person, and he was owned by an Army military doctor who initially lived in Illinois and then Wisconsin Territory, both free areas. All right, slavery was illegal in both of those places, so they were free areas. But the doctor eventually settled in Missouri, which was a slave state, after he left the Army. Okay. So with the help of anti-slavery lawyers, Scott sued for his freedom, saying that he lived in free states, thus he should be free. All right, that makes sense, right? Well, the court came back and said that Scott was not a free man for 2 reasons. All right, so Scott could not have his freedom because, 1, he had no right to sue in the U.S. court because African Americans were not citizens. So he didn't even have a right to a case to begin with because he wasn't a citizen because he was African American. 2, living in a free territory did not living in a free territory did not make an enslaved person free. So just because that slave had lived in there with their owner or their master in Illinois or Wisconsin didn't make that slave free. And this showed us 2 things. So the ruling said 2 things, but this resulted in 2 huge things from this court case. 1, it ruled, or basically told us that slaves were now considered property, and property rights were protected by the U.S. Constitution. So that was a huge shift for Southern people. That made them very happy. So now they're slaves who were technically protected under the U.S. Constitution because of this court case. Number 2, Congress did not have the power to prohibit slavery in any territory. All right? So therefore, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. The government could not say free or slave state. So that line, gone. All right? People got to make the decision. The government could not. So Southerners obviously very happy and said slavery should be legal everywhere because all these things had been set up illegally because under the Missouri Compromise or they'd been unconstitutional. And obviously this made the North very upset. So you can see all this tension on all these boards is the reason why we ultimately lead up to the Civil War, because the free states get enough states where the southern populations feel they're outnumbered and they're not being treated fairly. And so it results in the Civil War. We're going to talk more about some of these events and some other things we didn't talk about. But this video clearly shows how we're destined for the Civil War.